Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you today. Obviously, the title of my talk is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I have to say that I'm a bit concerned at the lack of focus on the farmer-centric element of the title of this conference. And if you get nothing else out of this talk, I hope that at the end of it all, you'll realise that if we want to make some serious progress, we need to give much more focus to the farmer-centric component of on-farm experimentation. So here's some data all collected by a farmer several years ago and over several years, a series of yield maps, a high-resolution soil survey, some imagery, and a map of management zones that have been generated from the other layers. Now, this is a deliberately old slide because we've known how to do this for a long time. It'd be fair to say that the software that helps the farmer or his advisor get to this point is probably lacking, but nonetheless, nothing terribly new about that. But the management zone map at the top poses an interesting question. Having identified some zones, how do we decide how to fine-tune management so that it can be appropriately and differentially applied in the different zones? Well, that question was the thinking behind this book, which Simon Cook and I produced over 20 years ago now. And it would be fair to say, I think, that not a great deal of progress has been made in that time in terms of addressing the question of how farmers work out how to fine-tune their management. And maybe that's why we particularly need to focus on this farmer-centric element to on-farm experimentation. Here's the design of a vineyard that a farmer wanted to do in a vineyard in the Langhorne Creek region of South Australia many years ago now. There was a concern at some soil constraints and the effects of wheel compaction in the interrow, and the farmer wanted to explore a couple of different options for potentially addressing those constraints. And we said to him, well, why don't you do the experiment over the whole of the vineyard? This is about a 7-hectare vineyard. And he thought that was a pretty good idea. And so in partnership with the farmer, we laid down this particular experimental design. The thinking behind it being that in GIS, we could separate out the two treatments and the control and analyze them separately. And indeed, that's exactly what we did. The vineyard was harvested with a yield monitor, and so yield maps for each of the individual treatments could be generated independently of each other, and then using simple map algebra, subtract the control map from the two treatment maps to identify these maps of benefit, then look at the difference between the two benefit maps to see where one treatment delivered a benefit relative to another, and then finally imposing some rules so that, as well as identifying which treatment had the greater benefit, also indicating how large we wanted that benefit to be in order to make a decision. Now, the vineyard manager thought that this was great. He liked this experiment. He could wander around the vineyard and see the treatment effects for himself, and he liked this optimal solution that we came up with at the end. But it would be fair to say that the statisticians were horrified. They thought that this was an experiment that lacked rigor, and they really didn't want to have much to do with it. And indeed, it would be fair to say that there are commonly scientist objections to farmer-centric on-farm experimentation, nearly always built around perceptions of lack of statistical rigor, perhaps with respect to randomization, replication, and indeed the lack of perceived statistical basis for knowledge creation or transfer. And sometimes there are some other forms of what I would describe as intellectual snobbery. Now, in terms of replication, it's worth pointing out something that a wise man once told me, and that is that it's impossible to take the same soil sample twice. Now, if you think about that, what does it say about replication? If we look at a yield map like this, and it would be fair to say that many people have forgotten that yield maps are the simplest form of experiment. They're a uniformity trial. This particular yield map over 57 hectares is underpinned by over 17,000 data points. What does that say about replication, those 17,000 data points? The other thing to say about a map like this is that there are clearly discernible and explainable patterns in the map. And if a farmer were to do an experiment in this block, what value possibly would accrue through randomization when he knows perfectly well that the low yielding areas of the field are due to shallow and calcareous soils. The higher yielding areas have much deeper soil. What value would accrue from randomizing treatments in an experiment conducted in that field aimed to fine-tune management? Well, at this point, it's worth drawing attention, I think, to some recent research done by a PhD student, Xinjin Song, who's been looking at grower information needs to underpin experimentation in the wine sector in Australia. And it would be fair to say that the vast majority of growers and consultants that she's interviewed conduct their trials every year. The primary objective of those trials is to enable those growers and consultants to make more confident management decisions. And yet, aside from a small number of growers who have technical support available, none of them perform statistical analysis on their experiments. They use simple comparisons to assess the merits of treatments. And in terms of using those trials to underpin practice change, it's things like the efficacy and the cost that are the primary drivers of whether or not they act on the results of an experiment. And I like this characterization of the difference between raw data and stories that data can tell that appeared on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago, which very closely characterizes the results of Xinjin Song's work, in as much that farmers are very happy to facilitate and be involved in the collection of data. And they are very keen on receiving explanations of that data packaged in some sort of story. But they're completely disinterested in the analysis that allows you to get from the data to the story. And so they need some help and guidance in getting from one to the other. Back to vineyard experimentations, and here's a somewhat similar experiment to the one I showed you before that we did in the Clare Valley of South Australia, again several years ago. And by the time we did this experiment, we had the advantage of the Bishop and Lark method for doing a spatial assessment of treatment effects and of the significance of differences between them. So again, in this vineyard experiment, looking at floor management options, we could interpolate maps of the individual treatment effects using Bishop and Lark's method, but also now could produce maps of the statistical significance of the difference between those treatments. So an important advance in terms of keeping the critical statisticians happy in terms of the value of on-farm experimentation. However, one thing with Bishop and Lark's method is that it was a global analysis method. And if the treatment responses were to be assessed using things like yield monitors or other sensors, that presents a difficulty in terms of computer capacity of most desktop computers. So I just draw your attention to two recent advancements that facilitate that. We have Warren Jin's paper that uses a local co-kriging method to do those experimental analyses underpinned by Shuvo Bakar's method for determining the size of a neighborhood for doing that local analysis. Of course, the grower doesn't really care about any of that. He's happy to wander around the vineyard and perhaps armed with a remotely sensed image to help him identify where the different treatments are and what effects they're having. He can see for himself the value of the experiment. In the broadacre grains industry, we've found growers tend to be much more interested in doing strip-based trials. So here's a trial being done by a farmer in Tarlee, about an hour north of Adelaide, a 64-hectare field, and these strips have been laid down to help a mid-season nitrogen fertiliser decision. So in the pale green, we have an N-rich strip. In the yellow, we have a nil or an N- strip, and of course the rest of the field is fertilised at the farmer's normal rate. And both the rich and the N- rates were also determined by the farmer. And prior to making his mid-season decision around GS31, the farmer can go through using his own, in this case, a crop spec sensor. And he also, in this particular case, has a handheld sensor as well that he can use to assess the effects of the different strips. And the real benefit, of course, of an experiment established by a farmer like this is that researchers can then piggyback onto it and come and make some of their own measurements if they want to. And one of the things that we've been doing in this project is looking at this moving window analysis method along the strip, using both proximal sensing and remote sensing to underpin that mid-season decision. And at harvest, we can also assess the benefits of the treatments using yield monitors and protein sensors, and look at ways in which those treatments, overlain on the variability that naturally occurs underneath that strip, looking to see how that information can be used to inform a better decision. Of course, the farmer and the farmer's agronomist needs some help in the analyses of those things, and we've produced this PAT plugin for QGIS that enables that to occur. People interested in these tools can just send an email to pat@CSIRO if they want further information. And one of the things that we've been playing around with, which we think is particularly useful in this particular example, this is not yet incorporated into PAT, but a moving window determination of the optimum nitrogen rate. This is work that Andre Colasso has been doing as part of my team. And as you can see, as the window moves along the strip, the farmer and his advisor can get a picture of the optimum nitrogen rate determined in this example on the basis of both grain removal or partial profit. Well, I think it was about 2005 that Alex McBratney made the comment that just as precision agriculture enables us to do these kinds of experiments, its successful adoption probably depends on them. And I would just add to that the one reason I think for that is that we can probably question whether our agronomic knowledge is good enough to inform targeted decision making without conducting experiments. And indeed, borrowing the concept of the efficiency frontier from Peter Carberry and Brian Keating, we can think about different methodologies that allow us to shift between different frontiers. They hypothesized that things like soil biology and farm rationalization allowed us to get from the situation in 1980 to where things were in 2010, and identified that technologies such as precision agriculture might allow us to de-risk a little bit and shift onto this dotted line efficiency frontier. And then there were possibly some other technologies that have only to some extent been introduced that might allow us to move up in this vertical direction. And I'd suggest that spatially distributed on-farm experimentation is one avenue for moving up this new line and possibly to shifting us to a new frontier altogether going forward. Well, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much. As I say, I'd encourage everybody to put as much thought as they can into the farmer-centric component of what we're talking about. Thanks very much.